Just really quickly before we get started, I believe that we're planning on recording this session as well. I just want to confirm, yes, it looks like we are recording and we're set to go there. For those of you that maybe are unfamiliar with who I am, my name is Trista, and as I mentioned very briefly a few moments ago, I work in the Office of Student Financial Services here at the university. I'm very excited to be able to come and share some information with you related to some of the work that I have the opportunity to do here. A lot of my work is kind of I like to call it a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But one of my favorite things to do is work with students. And the way that I have the opportunity to do that is exactly by doing sessions like this related to, as we can guess by looking at the screen, financial wellness. As we go through this presentation, we're going to talk about a couple of different things here today. And you'll see that in our agenda here. First, we're just going to talk a little bit about what financial literacy and financial wellness actually is and what that means. Okay. I know it's kind of an odd feeling when we put financial and wellness next to each other. They don't feel like warm, fuzzy hugs to go together. So we're going to try and make it more like that. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the more timely things that are probably important to the vast majority of our students here, given that we are getting near the end of the term, and for many of us, getting near the end of our program, or if not near the end of our program, moving into the next phases of it. So we want to make sure we're talking about our finances more than just kind of in the scope of today, but also for tomorrow, right? Which means that we're going to talk about some of those things that kind of land in the realm of consumer finances. And when we talk about consumer finances, really all that means is just stuff that consumers have to do and experience, okay? And good news, we're all consumers, so it should be helpful. We'll also talk about iGrad as well. So if you're not familiar with iGrad, we'll go over what that is, but very briefly, it is a wonderful, fantastic, no-cost resource that's available to you here at the university related to financial education, literacy, and wellness. And you'll see a lot of the information from there in the presentation today. And we'll also have resources as well as my contact information will be here in the event that you have any questions. I'm more than happy to take them. If you see me taking my eyes to the side of the screen, it is just that I am watching the chat. I like to try and be as attentive as possible. If I don't get to your question as you ask it, please know I will. We have a couple of spots where we'll stop to do that today, but ask away as you go, pop it right in there. More than happy to help. And the more engaged that you are, the better this is going to be, because if you have a question, the vast majority of people probably have it as well. You'll also see that there is a QR code here on the screen. That is where the session materials will be after the end of the session. Please feel free to go ahead and scan away. I have it on the last slide as well if you don't get to it now. But we are going to go ahead and get started, given that we have a good amount of information to get through today. So as we start thinking about, financial wellness, right? As I said, it doesn't always feel kind of like this wellness sense type of word. For many of us, finances really just means math. I'm one of them. However, we want to make sure that we're thinking about our finances in the greater scope of how we feel about our lives every day, right? So if we were to go to Alice Health's understanding of the 7 dimensions of well-being, we would see that they encompass the areas that include spiritual well-being, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, career, and way at the bottom, we have financial, right? Kind of the odd one out, if we want to think of it that way. However, if we were to think about our finances, we'd probably very quickly see that a lot of these areas are either impacted by or impact each other, including in the realm of our finances, right? Given that we are students, we certainly know intellectual wellness is very important, but we also know that going to school does have some financial commitment to it, right? So we know that one impacts the other. On the other side of that, we can also think about our social well-being, right? For many of us, being social means that we're going out and we're having a good time and we're able to be with our friends. But if our finances are a little bit taxed, it can be stressful in the sense that maybe we can't do as much as we'd hope to do. So if we want to look at a more formal definition of what that really means, right? Financial wellness, we can go ahead and look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which if you're not familiar with who they are, they're just a consumer protection agency here in the US. But they suggest that financial wellness is a state of being where you have control over your day-to-day and your month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock. You're on track to meet your financial goals, and you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. So that last bullet point right there is really where that warm fuzzy starts to happen, right? It's like, oh, I want to be able to do all those things. I want financial freedom. This is exactly what financial wellness is meant to represent, right? It's having the control and the capacity to get us to that point. So then, how do we go ahead and find ourselves at financial wellness land, right? That means we need to start talking about financial literacy. And as we can see on the right-hand side of our screen, that is the path to financial wellness. It's a set of skills that encompasses knowing when and how to find reliable information to make a financial decision, knowing how to process financial information to make a sound financial decision, not just any decision, but one that makes sense given the information that's available to us, and then knowing how to execute financial decisions, adapting as necessary to stay on track. So looking at the two of them next to each other, we have a lot of knowing, knowing, knowing on the right-hand side, right? That's that financial literacy side. Then having, 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 where we want to be, that's the wellness side. We do need something to help us bridge that gap though, right? Because again, we don't just get to learn things and then have things. We have to take a trip. And that's where this last little bit on our slide is going to come in. Okay, so in addition to that knowledge component, financial literacy also has an action component. Very simply, that just means taking the information that you have, the knowledge that you have, and putting it to use. So as we go through this today, keep that in the back of your mind, right? Everything we talk about here is meant to be informational. Also, again, you'll have resources here. So if there's something that you miss on a slide and you were trying to write it down, please do not feel like you're not going to get the materials. You will. We have those for you. But remember, as we talk about this is all in the interest of feeling good about our finances. So as we start thinking about where we are in kind of the financial planning life cycle, which really all that is the general age-based set of milestones that measure kind of financial preparedness, depending on where you are in life, right? And you'll see that we have 5 of them here. These are important when we start thinking about any type of transition in our financial futures, right? So for some of us, as I mentioned before, we may be transitioning to the next piece of our academic pursuits, or for some of us, we're actually transitioning to maybe the workforce, right? Or we're changing what we're doing in the workforce. It really just depends on the who, what, where of what's going on in your life today. So as we think about this, by far and large, I'm guessing the vast majority of us are probably going to be in the 2 areas that we have on our bullet pointed list there. That's kind of in yellow of the 5 different areas that we'll talk about here. Those age-based milestones, right? The first of which is the starting out years. For most of us, that's kind of where we land in the undergraduate side of study, right? The nesting years is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's where we start to build our quote family, right? And when we talk about family, this is just, again, those years where we're starting to move into developing who we are as people and the people that will be around us. It doesn't mean marriage necessarily. It doesn't mean children necessarily. It's whatever your next stage to kind of build your life is going to be, right? Then we have the wealth accumulation years. Those sound fantastic, right? It's where we're getting ready for the next stage of our lives, okay? Which is the prime time years. And for some people, they also include the reinvention years. And these are what they kind of sound like. It's what we see when we start to get towards retirement, right? Prime time, awesome. We're going to be finishing things up with our work careers, right? We're going to be taking time for ourselves. And then reinvention is when we actually do it, okay? So when we talk about things here today, we're going to kind of really focus on those 2 bullet points that I mentioned, the nesting years and the wealth accumulation years, because they're the ones that are very likely to be the, what is most important to you, okay? As you see on the right-hand side of the screen, it's really interesting to look at kind of where those land all together. Down at the bottom, we have age-based information, so 30, 40, 50, right? And again, these are averages. They do not have to be the exact age that you are, but we'll see that we have that family formation idea here and family development, and there's some maturity information down at the bottom, but at the top, we also see we're building some wealth here. It also gives us some clues about the things that are important to be aware of in the conversation, given the time of life that we're in, right? We need to start thinking about some of the debt that we have. Yes, many of us have accumulated some, right? Myself included. I have student loans. I am with you for those who do, okay? But at the same time, we also want to make sure we're thinking about how much we're consuming, right? Which we'll continue to do throughout our lives. But right now, for many of us, we're going to be starting to work, right? Which means we'll have some money to be able to do that. So consumption and then how much we have left over for savings is important. Insurance planning, if you haven't thought about that just yet, because many of us haven't, is something that's important. And when we say insurance, it's about just, again, insuring those things that are important to you. And there's several different types of insurance out there, which we're not going to go into today, but I have a lot of really great resources for you on that as well. And you'll also start to see things like investment land in there, right? We're talking about wealth accumulation. That's where investments start to come in. And by far and large, the first one that any of us will work with is our retirement planning, right? So the whole point of this is just to say we want to think about this in the individual context of who, what, where we are today, where are we now, where are we going next and why, right? Again, what's important to us, how do we get there? We need to start making a plan. And then when and what is our own finish line, right? We always want to have that end goal in sight, knowing that whatever we do today is a direct impact on what happens for us tomorrow. So with that in mind, we want to make sure we're taking care of us tomorrow by doing things important today, right? Now, this is something that sounds really, really obvious for many of us, right? However, okay, as people, we know that we have some biases here, right? And there are 2 that I wanted to mention in the context of this conversation today. The first of which is mental accounting bias, right? Which very simply is the tendency to mentally sort our funds in this context into separate categories, right? You might see that in kind of a budget almost, right? This is the stuff that I have for my housing expenses. This is what I have for my fun expenses. This is what I have for this and that and so on. However, budgeting is a very, kind of tactile version of this. For some people, it's a little different in that, let's say you get maybe, a windfall, a tax refund, maybe. That money is, surprise money. I'm not going to think about it in the way that I would the other money that I already have committed to things, right? We perceive the value of objects relative to other reference points rather than in absolute terms. Again, so when we get money today, a lot of the time we think about us today. Okay. Today is our reference point. We want to make sure we're thinking about tomorrow. And one of the interesting things that can happen with mental accounting bias is the sense of decoupling, which really just separates our money from a purchase. This happens a lot with credit cards, believe it or not, right? If you're one of those people that needs to have actual money in your hand to realize how much you're spending, a credit card can be, a really challenging thing to work through because it doesn't feel like real money. Student loans are very much the same way. And then lastly, we have optimism bias, which very simply is that it isn't going to happen to me scenario, right? No one ever expects it's going to happen to them. Unfortunately, the likelihood is something will. So we want to make sure we're thinking ahead of some of those things that are really important, including some of the expenses maybe that we haven't thought about yet as students that are going to be important to us as we move forward. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. If you have student loans, that's something to make sure you're considering. But at the same time, you'll also see a bunch of other areas here, like life insurance. No one wants to have to talk about it, but it is something that's important, right? If we're going to be working, some of the travel expenses that may apply, those emergency funds that can be so critical when we're, in a position that maybe things hadn't gone as well as we had hoped, right? So we want to make sure we're thinking about the way we just more broadly engage with our money and how we are as people, and look for these areas where we may have some impact on those biases that are just going to put us behind. Where we tend to see these happen, right? First and foremost, retirement planning, right? So what we're talking about here is minimizing the importance that time has on creating a long-term value. That's one of those biases. And then how we see it is achieving other long-term financial goals, right? Instead of going ahead and putting money aside for retirement, we decide we're going to do a vacation. Maybe we're planning a wedding. We're going to buy a car or a home, things like that, right? I talked about credit cards earlier. Again, separates value of an item and money spent on it from each other based on the capacity for longer repayment needs, right? For many people, this is going to be where kind of the lack of emergency funds can be really tempting, right? If we don't have money set aside in an emergency fund, we may be in a position where the only alternative to us is using a credit card. And because it doesn't feel like the same type of money that we use every day, it's easy to lose track of where that's going. And then lastly, our sunk cost fallacy. And this one's such a funny word, sunk cost, right? But it does a really good job of explaining what it is, right? Very simply, I've already invested this much in it. It's like losing money if I abandon it now. That happens a lot in the stock market, right? You put your money into something, you're like, it's got to work. It's got to work eventually. I know it's going to work. We want to make sure we're making rational decisions, not we hope decisions, right? Now, the most important thing we can do to make sure that we do this well is start talking about a spending plan, right? What you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, this is actually our 5 steps to effective budgeting. And we're not going to go through all of these today, right? I want to make sure we're giving lots of good information all together. But at the same time, I want to show you exactly what they are, right? We have understanding our needs and wants. For many of us, that's pretty well established, though again, not always. I know I tend to kind of confuse needs and wants when there's something I really want and try to rationalize it as a need. Knowing our income and expenses, right? What we actually have coming in and out. Again, if you're somebody that's, just needs kind of a real dollar in front of you, so to speak, to feel that. When we have things like direct deposit going on, it can feel a little challenging to see where that's going, right? Defining and prioritizing our goals, what we do hope to achieve, and then really just assessing our spending plan, right? Did we actually come up with a plan that works for us and sticking to it, right? So those are all kind of the basic steps in kind of coming up with a budget. But for today, we're going to focus a little bit more on the income and expenses side of it, and then the developing spending plan side of it because of where we are in the conversation today, right? And when we say spending plan, all that really means is taking your money out of the just today understanding of it, which budget really kind of lands in that terminology as far as the timeline goes. For many of us, budget means looking at the money now. A spending plan gives us that future focus that's so important with wellness, right? Everything that we hope to achieve, we want to start planning for that future component of our money. As we do that, right, given where we are, if we're going to be either coming in for the next term or let's say we're graduating, right? We want to make sure we think about what our current income is. And income in this context can mean anything, whether it's working income or if you're still going to be in school, the resources that you use to pay for it, right? Any other available resources that we have, again, for those of us that may be going into the workforce, what our employer may be able to offer us to offset some of our costs. And then, of course, both our immediate and future expected income, right? We want to make sure we're taking care of those immediate needs that we have now, because if we don't, it just snowballs into making it hard for us later. So there's some really great things out there to help kind of project some of the things you'll need to know in order to plan for the future, right? As we continue with our consider the following part of this conversation, right? We want to make sure that we think about our current expenses too, right? What do we have now that's going to go away? And what might change in costs? For many of us, moving is something that may happen at the end of our program, and that can really change the amount that you have to pay for stuff, whether it's less or more. What you can and can't adjust, right? Some expenses are very kind of, liquid, meaning that they could be a little different depending on what you choose to do, or others very much are not. Your bill is your bill, and that's it, right? Those pieces of information are going to help you prioritize those things that have to be taken care of immediately versus where you can make adjustments if need be. We also need to make sure we're determining accurate projections, right? Anytime we talk about the future, we need to do our best to guesstimate what we expect to have happen there. Now, none of us, unfortunately, can tell the future, to my knowledge. I certainly can't, wish I could. But the good news is we have some tools to help us do that, right? You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is actually their their occupational earnings information, excuse me. And what this does is for several different types of careers, it's kind of a continuously updated book of information that shows you roughly how much people in the field are earning. And you can also look at certain areas within the country as well, right? So this is a little bit more broad and it's just one piece, a little summary of what you find there. The rest of it is actually linked here for you, so you can take a look at it more directly to get an idea for what you think your job may look like in the future. On the other side of that, we also have the Consumer Price Index, which isn't pictured here, but basically it's a percentage amount of the change of a basket of goods, so to speak, over time. And a basket of goods, very simply, is just stuff that consumers buy, whether it's your groceries, your milk, things like that. And that can be really helpful just to see how things change over time, right? For most of us, we know that things tend to go up in price, but how much do they go up? And what is the historic pattern? That can be helpful in that for you. We also have, for those of us that maybe aren't great with percentages, move.org has some really good information about general utility costs that you might see across the country. And iGrad, which we will continue to talk about in this presentation, that's that no-cost financial literacy resource that's available to you as a student here at the university and after you leave at no cost, which is really good as well. They have a ton of calculators that can help you just better understand what your money today may look like tomorrow, right? Including the future value of your investments, your savings amounts, and of course, debt repayment options. And some of those we'll go through today. The most important piece of this, though, is that you want to make sure, again, you're thinking about your values, your preferences, your wants and needs, and of course, the people that rely upon you and influence you, your family stakeholders, which sounds like such a funny way to say that, right? But they are stakeholders in your life as you are in theirs. It's important to be aware of that. Now, one of the tools that's available to you through iGrad to help with this process is their daily income and expense diary. And basically what this is it's an Excel spreadsheet that allows you to kind of literally track day by day the amount of money that has come in versus gone out, right? So it's very literal in that sense. If you were on day one, let's say, kind of towards the middle of the screen is where we're looking here. Let's say we get paid on day one, the amount that you get paid goes into the day one cell, right? Then if on day two we buy coffee, it goes into the appropriate expense, and so on and so on and so on. And we do that for a period of 30 days, and we get a chart that shows us a lot of really good information, okay? Some of that is on the left. You'll see that's kind of the dollar representation of how much was actually spent. And then down at the bottom, a summary of the totals, right? To show you whether or not you actually made it, so to speak. Right? We actually had enough money to cover the expenses. But if you're like me, I'm a bit more of a visual person. I tend to not want to look at the numbers so much, which is terrible. I shouldn't tell people that. But on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's this really nice pie chart that goes with it, right? I like the pie chart. You'll see in this example on that pie chart, this person has 57% of their expenses in their home expense categories, right? So that'll be things like utilities, your rent, your groceries, all that stuff that goes into it, right? Now, in this area, certainly in New York City, that's probably not a strange number, right? We know that it can be a little expensive living in this area. I live in New Jersey. It's not as expensive as New York City, but it is certainly costly, right? So that is not a surprising thing to see there. Now, if this, let's say, instead of being our housing expense, right, instead of those home expenses there, said something like fun expenses, Awesome. Great. That means you've got a lot of extra resources, okay, as long as you didn't go over and see a negative number in the amount that we have in the numeric side of things, right? But that also means that maybe we have some goals that we haven't started working toward that we want to repurpose our money for, right? This can show you if you're actually tracking the way that you want to. On the other side of that, if this said something like 57% was debt, right? That would certainly be concerning. And that would also tell us where we needed to focus our priorities and let us know that maybe there's something going on kind of more in the minutia of our finances that's making that a perpetual challenge for us. And we can look to seek out some of the help in the resources that are available for that. So this is one tool that's available to help you in this front. If you've already kind of gone through the process of knowing what your income and expenses are, I imagine for many of us that's the case, right? We also have for you iGrad Simple Budgeting Worksheet, okay? And this is very much like our previous document. However, this is designed to kind of do this over the span of a year instead of a month, okay? So you'll see this idea in the top middle left of our screen, this how am I doing box that's there. We have our total income, the planned amount, the actual amount, and then the difference, right? And that goes for expenses as well. And then we get the calculated amount for the difference, right? To go with that, we also have what you're seeing at the middle of our screen. We have dollar for dollar variance information and percentage-based variance information, both for month-to-month information. And from there, totals for the year, right? And it also has some charts to go with it, which we have on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can, again, for this, very much the same concept, but if you're looking to better understand how your finances look now and how they may need to change, or even just get a better sense for, are you actually guessing right, so to speak, right? Going through and coming up with those values in a way that's really helpful for you, this would be a great tool to help you do that. You'll notice at the bottom of several of these screens, there are links, like this one has the simple budgeting worksheet. Those will be linked in the presentation materials for you, so you can go ahead right to those resources and get them. So I wanted to take a moment to talk just about some of those expenses that come up as students, right? Not that all of us are going to continue to be students after the end of this term. Some of us will, some of us will not, but this can be really helpful information in a few different contexts. Now, when we think about cost of attendance, right, all that really is it's a representation of the amount a student may reasonably expect school to cost over an established period of time. So how does that help us, right? As you can see on the right-hand side of our screen, this is just an example of what some of those things that go into cost of attendance are. This is not representative of your cost of attendance necessarily. It's just a snapshot of, Johnny's student, so to speak. And you'll see that we have categories here like living expenses, transportation, and personal expenses that aren't unique to school, right? Those are things that we actually have to pay for. Now, how we use this then, if we're going to be, let's say, maybe not continuing after the term because we're finishing up our program, we can use that cost of attendance with those previous tools that we talked about to approximate some of our future costs, right? We can go in and see what ones were school expenses, how were we paying for them here, knowing that we will need to continue to pay for them. And then from there, find those things that weren't listed in our school expenses and look to approximate those costs, right? Now, if you aren't finishing your studies, right, you can go ahead then and use this to kind of predict what your future terms may look like, right? This is so that you can kind of get a better idea as to what a full period of time may cost, given the unique school expenses that you have. And to go with this, I have a really nice resource that kind of talks about some of the more commonly forgotten areas within a budget. I know I've forgotten a few of them every once in a while. Subscriptions tend to get everybody. They're surprising, aren't they? I know just the other day I got charged for a year on something. I went, oh, I forgot I had it. Those areas that can creep up on you quickly. So this is just, again, a resource to kind of help in the context of the conversation that we're having today. Now, another tool that's available to you from iGrad, this is very similar to the two that we just talked about in that it's a budget-related tool, but the big difference here is that it's meant to be dynamic. And what I mean by that is you'll see there's a couple of stars and outlines here on the screen. I like pictures, that's me. But these are to highlight some of the areas that can be really, really helpful to you, right? So first, you'll notice there are sliding scales here for the different areas. Of course, you can type in different values as well for things like income, the support that you have, your expenses, right? But that sliding scale can be really helpful if you're looking to adjust just one area a little bit up or down and see if it makes a big enough difference for you in what you need to adjust for, right? Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, up at the top right, we'll see there's this monthly savings and goals section. So for many of us, trying to plan for long-term goals can be really challenging, myself included. It's not always easy to tell roughly how long it should take you to do that without going through and doing a lot of math. This particular tool will let you go ahead and add that information directly into your budget. And as you do that, it'll ask you for a few different things. One, how much do you have toward this goal already? to, when do you hope to achieve it by? From there, that's really pretty much it. And once you add all of that information, it'll actually go ahead and adjust your budget and put it right in there for you. Now, the reason that's so helpful is if we're looking towards the center of our screen where it says budget status, we have this positive that's listed there. If you were to add a goal and it went into the negative territory, that means we don't have enough to cover the expense that we just added. We can do a couple of things there. We can go in, revise the goal. Perhaps we make it lower. Perhaps we extend the timeline. However, if it's something that's really important to us, maybe there's other areas like that fun expense bucket we talked about a few moments ago that we can adjust in here, right? We can use our sliding scale to adjust and see if that puts us in a place where we're reasonable, right? So again, this is one tool of several that we'll talk about here that are meant to help you as you start to prepare for whatever your next phase is in school or beyond school. Now we're going to move into the next phase of our presentation. Before we do, I just want to check and see if we had any questions. I don't see that any popped up, but if that changes, please do ask. I am more than happy to take questions. I like them. Okay. For now, we'll continue on. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about credit and debt, just because, again, as students, many of us, we started to have our first foray into the understanding of credit and debt when we started to borrow student loans, or if we haven't done that before, it's something that takes a little bit of time to get acclimated to if you've never used it, right? And when we talk about credit, excuse me, very simply, that's the borrowing capacity of an individual or company. It's a very, very simple statement. However, I like to think of it more as a trust relationship, right? So let's say you have a friend that you've known for a while, asked to borrow $100, right? What do we do when that happens? We say, okay, well, who is this? How well do I know them? Do I have experience having lent them money before? And if so, how did that go? If not, who else do I know that maybe has had that experience? Did it go well? If it didn't go well, are we likely to lend to them? Probably not, right? That's exactly what happens with your credit, okay? For that reason, you typically cannot borrow most types of credit without having a credit history. That's that trust record that you're building as you engage in the credit cycle, okay? Lenders very simply will evaluate credit to determine your eligibility to borrow. And for that reason, it's important to note that when we talk about different lenders, each lender is typically going to have their own criteria for determining how somebody becomes eligible to either get the credit card that they're offering or potentially a loan that they're offering, whatever it happens to be, right? They're all unique and different. And for that reason, there's a chance that you very well may need a cosigner when you're looking to borrow some type of loan, whether it's a school loan or not. But there are some unique differences here and there that can change that conversation. The other thing you'll notice is beyond it being a lender to lender type of difference, it also depends on the industry that you're looking at as well, right? So if we were to think about, let's say, getting a credit card versus trying to get a mortgage, those are two very different experiences, right? One has collateral and it has a long-term value potential associated with it, where the other is meant for daily in and out cash. That's the credit card, right? Now, to that end, the only way to start building credit is to start using it. But it's important that as we do that, we remember that we build it by not just using our credit, but also paying our bills on time. And we'll get into why that's so important in just a moment. Before I do, I did want to also make mention of the image that we have on the right-hand side of our screen. This is actually a Start Here guide that's available to you, NIGRAD, and it's one of about 40 of them. Last I counted, it may be 50. It's been a little while since I counted, but there's several of them across a gambit of different topics. This one here is everything you need to know about credit. And the idea behind these is that they are extended articles, right? So maybe something will take about 10 minutes to read or so. That's going to give you a nice introduction to whatever the topic you're looking at happens to be. In this case, it would be credit. So if there's an area that you're looking to learn more about that you just aren't really sure even where to start, these Start Here guides can be really, really helpful for that reason. And they will be linked here on the presentation for you, so you can take a look at all the ones that are there. So continuing on in the credit side of the conversation, when we talk about credit, inevitably we have to talk about credit scores. That's kind of the term most people are familiar with as they start to get familiar with credit, right? And when we talk about credit scores, the most common type of credit score you will see is called a FICO or Fair Isaac Corporation score, okay? All that really means is that's the company that determines the calculation for coming up with a credit score, right? There's more than one. By far and large, FICO is the most popular, though we are starting to see a few others pop up. And the way that you know which one is being used, unfortunately, is that you don't. That's going to be something that's unique to the individual lender that they are choosing, or you are choosing, I should say. Now, if you did want to find out a little bit more, you certainly could ask the lender if you're applying for something. They would be able to tell you more for sure. Now, the actual number itself, very simply, is a 3-digit numeric representation of the information that's on your credit report, right? Which is very similar to your credit history. It's that record of your history, right? In most cases, your score will range from 300 to 850, and very simply, the higher the score, the better your credit, right? And you'll see on the left-hand side of our screen, we have a representation of what some credit scores may be considered as far as, good, fair, excellent, things like that. Typically, again, the higher the amount, the better. And you'll see that that 800 plus section that's here, it says your score is well above the average score of US consumers. That's where we want to be, but it takes time to get there, right? So how does ultimately that score get derived, right? Creditors, really any lender that you're working with, report data to credit bureaus, okay, according to their own schedule, most of the time in 30 to 45 days, though. And what they're reporting is, again, just the record of what's occurred with your engagement with that particular lender, credit card, whatever it happens to be, right? Now, the other thing to be aware of is that your credit score is not the entire conversation, right? It's the one that we're most familiar with, but it doesn't represent everything that goes into being eligible for something, right? For that reason, lenders may consider additional information that could come from a couple of different places, right? It could be other information on your credit score, okay? For that reason, you want to be aware that they may look at things like public records or credit inquiries that are also maintained on your credit report. A really good example of this would be something like a bankruptcy. Bankruptcies, believe it or not, they're not great, but they don't actually change your score, but they do show up on your credit, right? It means that somebody can see that it's there, and even though it's not changing the number, it's certainly making a difference into whether or not somebody would like to lend something to you. It's also important to note that some of the other things that you wind up giving in an application are very likely to be considered in your eligibility to borrow, right? For example, the income amount that you provide. For most of us, if we've ever applied for a credit card online, normally you're kind of going through and they go, well, how much do you pay in rent? How much is your monthly income? And then they tell you whether or not you're pre-approved, right? They're doing that because they want to assess something called debt to income ratio. Do you have enough income to support taking on more debt without looking like it's a risky thing to do? Now, how exactly is that FICO credit score built? Okay, as we can see on the right-hand side of our screen, we have 35% of that goes into our payment history, 30% into the amounts that we owe overall. Then we have length of our credit history, which is 15%, and then equally at 10% each, we have new credit. Okay, what those actually mean. When we talk about payment history, that's probably the most obvious one. 35% of your score is just the timeliness of your payment history over time. Very simply, your score is going to be higher if you pay on time, right? It's such a big bucket in how they assess that score. And that's the case for any type of credit assessment I've seen, even if it wasn't FICO. Your payment history is going to be the most important thing that you focus on. Now, it'd be great if this was a one-to-one relationship where I made a payment on time equals, one positive, let's say, instead of it, not making a payment on time is one negative. Unfortunately, again, remember, this is like a trust relationship. When somebody, does something that we don't feel great about, let's say in this case, maybe they miss a payment, that can be almost an immediate negative impact. And it takes a while to come back from that, right? We don't just have that one payment to make to fix that issue. It doesn't go one-to-one. We need to rebuild the trust by paying again on time over and over and over. Now, amounts owed, 30%, that is very simply how much credit you're using in relation to how much credit you could be using, right? Or it's otherwise called credit utilization. When we talk about credit utilization, generally, we recommend not carrying more than a 30% balance in relation to, let's say, your credit card available balances. So if you have a $1,000 credit limit available to you, the maximum you can borrow, you don't want to have more than a $300 balance on it going from month to month, okay? The idea here is that if you're using all of that credit that's available to you, it looks like you don't have enough resources immediately, which can look like risk according to a lender, right? Now, length of your credit history, this is very simply how long you've been borrowing money, but as you'll see, there's a little asterisk there because I say simply, and it's really not as simple as simple. It's not just how long you've been engaging with credit. Instead, it's the length of time between your oldest and your newest credit accounts, right? So what that means, let's say you get a credit card, it's your first one, or 19 years old, maybe it's, got this really high interest rate, but we know it's important to start building credit. And then a few years later, because we've been doing good things, our credit score started to build a little bit, we've been engaging with our credit responsibly, we get an offer for a better rate. And we decide, fantastic, that's way better for me. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Do we close the old card or not? If you have a reason to do so, this isn't to say you shouldn't, right? However, you wouldn't want to necessarily just close it to close it, because that means that beginning of your credit history is just going to whoop, off it goes. And you now only have the one card that's being assessed on. To that end, it is only 15%. It's not the most important thing in your credit score. So again, if you have a reason that you need to close a card, you should do so, but you don't want to just do it just to do it. Now, new credit and credit mix at 10%. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because they aren't, the biggest part of our scores, but new credit is very simply the act of applying for a new card or a loan, right? The idea here, very much like we talked about with the credit utilization, is the more that you apply, the more it looks like you need access to credit, which can look like risk. It is important to note, though, as we go in this conversation, there are different types of applications that are associated with credit pulls, right? Or, actually obtaining somebody's credit record. A hard inquiry are those that are actually related to your eligibility to borrow. So when you apply for some type of lender's type of product, whether it's a credit card, a loan, something like that. Now, a soft inquiry, on the other hand, those are related to general reviews, right? It could be something that you're looking at yourself, or another entity that's looking in relation to something outside of being eligible for something related to, a loan or a borrowed opportunity, right? This can happen for a few different reasons. Sometimes employers do it. Again, if you're looking at your own credit report, that's something to be aware of. Those do not get retained on your credit report, okay? And then credit mix is the diversity of your credit portfolio, right? Where possible, and if appropriate to do so, you want to have a mix of different types of credit, meaning you wouldn't want to just have all mortgages. Why? That's a lot of mortgages for one. Two, it means that there's not a lot of variance in the type of opportunities you're looking at. Would you want to just have credit cards? Ideally not, right? Because those are, again, day-to-day in and out cash. They all kind of look the same. So if you have the capability to, and the reason to borrow to do so, to adjust things that way, you should look to do so. Very simply, by keeping our credit score low, that means that we have healthy credit, and healthy credit means lower rates, and lower rates mean lower payments. So one of the things that we can do to our benefit here is try and reduce the amount that we owe, right? We saw how important it is to have that credit utilization low. We want to make sure we're minimizing how much we borrow where we can. Again, to reiterate, because it's so important, borrow money and pay it off on time, right? It's so easy to see your credit score go down by missing a payment. Now, one of the tools that can be really helpful to you as a student and as a consumer, this is iGrad's credit card paydown tool. One of the most common questions that I get is, I don't know what I should be doing if I have debt. Excuse me. As far as trying to get that to be, lower than it currently is, right? Especially if you have higher interest rates, we know that that just adds to stuff after a while. Is it worth it to do one thing over another? This is meant to help you make that decision, right? So very simply, you have the opportunity to enter as you go through and use this tool, the types of credit that you have, including cards, loans, things like that. And as you do that, you'll get a document that looks very much like this. It'll show you the different strategies that may be available to you as a consumer to go ahead and pay off a balance, right? You'll see balance transfer, fixed amount, minimum payment. They will make not a recommendation, but a suggestion as to what may be the most beneficial to you, right? Nobody can tell you what you should do, but these are tools to help you do so. In this case, we'll see fixed amount was what was suggested. And in most cases, that's probably going to be the one that they recommend. The idea being that a fixed payment, any fixed payment that you can make over the amount of your actual bill is going to be a benefit to you. Why? Because anything extra you pay goes towards the principal of what you owe. Really helpful, makes it start to go down. And you'll see then on the left-hand side of our screen, we're seeing that in image form. And as I mentioned, I like pictures. This is what I like to look at. So on the left-hand side, you see our minimum payment amount. It shows that it would take more than 30 years to pay off our balance, in this case, which is $5,500 over 2 credit cards at 21.99% interest rate. Now, a fixed amount shows that we could pay that off in a year and 9 months, right? We're paying more than the minimum, which is awesome. And then balance transfer, it says a year, and I'll show you why it says that. Just on right to the right of that, you'll notice that we also have minimum payment, fixed amount, and balance transfer, and all the way at the right, that interest amount is 0 for balance transfer. This tool is making the assumption that you're going to be doing a balance transfer for your benefit at a 0% interest rate, which many credit cards do offer, right? It's important to be aware of, though, in the event that you don't pay your full balance within the year or whatever time period they do give you, because some of them may do a different time period, 2 things can happen. One, all of a sudden interest starts to accrue, right? Or you may even have retroactive interest, right? They may put it back on to the beginning. So it's important to read the documents with any opportunity that you pursue, just so that you're aware of what could happen if you don't have the capability to meet the plan that you intended. Now, another tool that they have here, this is actually their credit score estimator, which sounds a little silly, right? In that, well, if I need my credit score, I can get a credit report, and that typically will tell me, right? However, as we start to go into this area where we may be looking to utilize different types of credit and lending opportunities, we may want to be a little bit more aware of how we're using our credit. And this can be a great way to approximate what might happen under certain conditions, right? So on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see here, we've got a couple of questions that are being answered. This is how the tool works. And same thing on the right, but we have one big significant difference between these two things, and it's when did you last miss a payment on any of your credit accounts? On the left-hand side, the individual answered more than 2 years ago, or on the right-hand side, it was in the last 6 to 12 months. And for that reason, we saw a significant difference in what these potential credit scores may be, right? Unfortunately, for the person that missed a payment in 6 to 12 months, that's 604 to 654, significantly lower than otherwise, a 724 to 774. So that's one way that you can potentially use this, right? If you're in a position where you may miss a payment, you want to see what it might do, how do we prioritize, that kind of thing. Also, they also ask about when's the last time you applied for a new line of credit, right? We know that that doesn't make as big an impact as missing a payment, but it does make one. I remember in my financial aid history and doing this with some, parents along the way, many of them being credit conscious. Let's say they were looking to potentially buy a home. They weren't sure if they wanted to, potentially co-sign a loan or take a loan for their student at that time because it meant applying for another opportunity and potentially borrowing more. So this can be helpful in making some of those decisions that you may not expect to pop up as you begin the process of using lending. A few points of note, again, closing an account doesn't make it go away, right? As we mentioned, closing a card can potentially be not a detriment. If you have a reason to do it, you should, but at the same time, it can change the total amount of the length of your credit history, right? And taking it off, closing it, unfortunately, doesn't mean that it goes away. The transaction record of your use with that card will still appear there for 7 years. You want to only apply for new credit cards or accounts as needed, again, because if you apply for a lot at once, it can look like risky behavior. And to note, there are some types of lending opportunities that are out there that allow you to do kind of this rate shopping idea. Things like if you're looking at a mortgage or potentially a car, right? Things that you might be shopping for different interest rates with different lenders. Those can potentially be accounted for a little bit differently, knowing that those are things that happen in those areas of borrowing, right? However, again, in most cases, you definitely do not want to be doing a bunch of applications at once unless it's something it makes sense for. Now, very important, read your disclosures. I cannot say that enough, right? When we talk about disclosures, these are any of the documents that you get in relation to something you are borrowing, very simply. If you are a federal student loan borrower or a private student loan borrower, you've gotten these before. Whether we realize it or not, different story, but you do, right? And this is actually something that is a consumer protection available to you as a consumer in the United States, right? And that's the case made, and the reason that that's the case is thanks to the Truth in Lending Act, right? Requires that you receive certain disclosures before you actually borrow, right? The things that are included there are typically going to be the interest rate, the amount that you are being charged for utilizing the credit that's being made available to you, and the total amount of your payments in the event that this is something that's got a fixed amount that you're borrowing, like a mortgage, right? It'll also include other important terms like the number of payments, the monthly payment amount, if there's late fees associated with it, whether you can prepay or not, right? For some types of lending opportunities, prepayment is a no-no, and they actually charge you more money to do that. It's not often, but it can happen. So the whole point being there's so many things that you need to be aware of in this process. Take the time, sit down, get cozy, read it whenever you're starting to feel a little sleepy. It's not interesting stuff, but it's important stuff to take a look at. And the good news is if you do have federal student loans, you actually have some of these to start with, right? You can use the lending options that you've already pursued and some of the documents that you've received to actually start looking at what disclosures look like and the information that's being shared with you. And I have a few examples of that in the presentation deck for you as well. Now, I cannot not iterate this enough. You have to look at your credit reports, right? As we know, unfortunately, there are very disingenuous people in the world, and it's not anybody here today, and it's not anybody that we know, but many of us do know people that have been impacted by situations that have occurred as a result of disingenuous people. My parents not long ago went through it with the whole identity theft thing, and it was a nightmare and a half. You don't want to have to deal with it. So you want to make sure that you're taking the time to be aware of what's going on your credit report, because it's probably the first place that you're going to see a potential issue, right? Oftentimes you'll see that there are late payments reported. Your credit score went down like you weren't expecting it. You've been paying on time. There's You know, you won't know necessarily that that's the issue unless you're looking at your credit report. The good news is you do have access to that for free as a US consumer, and I have that resource for you here in the presentation. In addition to that, we also have resources about how to report identity theft and credit card fraud, as well as in addition to trying to protect yourself from those things. And iGrad actually has a really good course related to protecting yourself from identity theft and scams as well, which is what you're seeing at the top right-hand side of the screen. Moving into student debt management, I don't see any questions, so I'm not going to go ahead and stop given the interest in time that we have here, but please do ask away if they come up. So we would be remiss if we were talking to students and didn't talk about some type of student loan, right? Why? Because many students have them. So when we talk about federal student loans, those are those loans that are offered to eligible students through the U.S. Department of Education via the William D. Ford Federal Direct Loan or Direct Loan Program. The Department of Education is the lender, right? And the loan programs that may apply are the ones that we are seeing listed here: direct subsidized loans, unsubsidized loans, plus loans, and consolidation loans. As borrowers of the at the graduate level, the ones that you're most apt to have are unsubsidized or plus loans. Now, private student loans, on the other hand, those are non-federal loans, right? They're made by different types of lenders, like a bank, a credit union, a state agency, sometimes a school, depending on the circumstances. And those terms and conditions, as we've talked about in the previous group of slides, are going to be very much related to the lending opportunity that was pursued. It's going to be told to you through that lender or servicer. Now, for federal student loans, the current interest rates are what we have here listed to the left on our slide. For subsidized and unsubsidized loans, they are currently at 5.5%. Now, they are fixed interest rate, but the reason I say currently is because it depends on when you started to receive that loan, or the school did on your behalf, I should say, right? So for some other loans that you have, they may be a little different than this, just because, again, it's based on when those loans were first received by a school. And if we've been borrowing throughout our education and academia and, you know, all of that history that we have, we're apt to have borrowed at different points in time, usually every year, right? So you want to go ahead and be aware that some of them are going to look a little different for that reason, but these are the current rates that are there. For that information related to any private lending that you have, again, you'll have to go back to the documents that were provided by your lender. In addition to that, you also want to make sure you're, again, reviewing your credit report, okay? Why? If you don't know that somebody borrowed something on your behalf, you're never going to think to look anywhere else to find it. So make sure that you're looking for that information. Now, it is important to think about how interest is calculated, right? Whenever we talk about interest, that's usually what makes loans and debt as costly as it is. And why? Because it often capitalizes. So when we talk about capitalized interest, all that really is it's the unpaid accrued interest amount that's then added to the principal balance of a loan. And we'll have an example of what that looks like in just a moment. You might also hear it called compound interest or interest on interest. Basically, it just means interest making things grow. Okay. Now, that's a benefit when it's in your savings account, but when we're borrowing things, it means you're paying it to somebody else, right? Important to note in that conversation is the compounding frequency. And really all that is how often things capitalize, right? The number of compounding periods in a year. The rate at which compound interest accrues depends on how frequently that occurs, right? And typically, the higher the number of compounding, the greater the compound interest. Why? Again, if we have a $1,000 loan and every month, let's say we have $10 in interest, and then we capitalize every month, we're adding $10 to the principal balance. So the next time it's going to be $12 in interest. And then we have $22 now in total interest, and it's going to go up and up and up and up. If you're capitalizing less frequently, you're not going to see that tacked onto your principal as often. Now, for federal student loans, we utilize what's called a simple daily interest formula to calculate that. I'm not going to go through that directly here since I do have an example that's a little easier to look at here, but I did want to make mention of what the actual calculation is. In addition to that, you'll notice they make mention of this interest rate factor, which I'll be honest, I was really lost the first time I saw it. I'm like, what? This sounds like a show. Dating myself. But all that really is it's how we get to this idea of the daily amount of interest charged, even though we don't have a daily interest rate associated with our loan, which is the case with federal student loans. We take the number of days in a year, divide it by our loan's interest rate, and then we have our interest rate factor, and we can use that to calculate how much interest accrues on our loan. And that is what you're seeing here. So with the example that we have on the screen, if we have a loan that is a $10,000 loan using a 6% interest rate, if we then divide that 6% by 365 days per year, we get roughly an interest rate factor of 0.016%, okay? We then take that 0.016% and multiply it by our $10,000 principal balance. That's the amount that we borrowed. And then we need to multiply by the 30 days since our last payment, right? The amount of time that's been since we paid and how much is accrued since then. We get a total of about, and I keep saying about because there was a lot of numbers at the tail end of that decimal point, but roughly $48, right? From there, we can take our $48, add it to our principal balance, and we have the new principal amount, $10,048. So I thought this was a little easier to see just because of the way it's laid out, rather than trying to look at a bunch of words that translate to numbers. And again, this is unique to those federal student loans that we talk about. As I've mentioned, again, how do we start to prepare for, federal student loans if we're going to be repaying those? We want to make sure we're monitoring things, right? Everything that we've talked about here today, including for private loans, our credit report. Of course, you want to monitor that anyway as you start to utilize credit. And the good news is, I just found this out today, actually. They're now starting to offer these on a weekly basis. You can get a free version of your credit report from each of the credit bureaus that exist, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, on a weekly basis. It used to be once per year for each one. So if you've never looked at your credit report before, now's the time to do it. Go ahead and take a peek. It costs you nothing, okay? In addition to that, we want to make sure we're developing our spending plan, right? Really important to make sure we do that because we don't know how much we can afford if we don't go through and actually assess the amounts that we have available versus what we have to pay for. And then lastly, we need to know where to go when we need help, right? It's going to happen inevitably. We don't want to think we're supposed to memorize everything related to, any type of area of finance. I certainly don't. I go back to resources very, very often because things change over time, right? The best thing that you can do as a consumer is know where you don't feel like you know enough. And in that instance, go ahead and find the information that can be helpful to you. Now, as far as tracking that as a federal student loan borrower, you can go ahead and look at your student aid summary on the studentaid.gov website. It has a lot of really good information there. In addition to the federal student loan simulator, which lets you kind of approximate the amount of your payment under several different conditions, including some of those potential forgiveness options that may be available. Again, you never want to, assume that you're going to be getting forgiveness. If you borrow a loan, you're saying you're going to pay for it. However, if you do qualify, it is something you should pursue. And this will be a way that you can go ahead and look and see what a benefit or not that may be to you, right? And of course, a little broken record, private loans, we want to make sure we're looking at our credit report. Now, from here, we're going to start talking a little bit about some of those things we can expect in relation to federal loans, given the federal student loan life cycle, right? What we expect to have happen as we get near graduation or move into the next stage of our academia, right? For most of us, we're currently in the in-school status of things, right? But if we're going to be getting ready to finish up our studies, we're going to have some documents we need to look at, including exit counseling, which gives you a ton of really great information about your federal student loans. You probably did some version of it that was called entrance counseling several years ago, and I know we all remember all of it. I don't remember all of mine. So the good news is you get a chance to do it before you leave, okay? And then it also is going to give us some document information related to what happens after we actually leave school, right? Whether or not we have some time before we have to start paying, which is what a grace or deferment period is, and some of the options that we have available for repayment. Now, this is just exemplary information, right? I wanted to show you some of the things that come up in direct loan exit counseling, which is what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. More importantly, though, again, this is really good information. You'll see it talks about the different types of loans that you may potentially have as far as federal loans go, as well as what your repayment may look like, and kind of the experience that you may have there. But on the right-hand side of the screen, and I think this is a bit of a, an unsung hero on the studentaid.gov website, you can get any document that the Department of Education has sent to you just by logging into studentaid.gov, including all of the disclosure information you've ever been sent, that mail that we get and kind of, whoop, I don't know what that is, and pop it to the side. Not that you should do that. Please don't. I've never done it myself, obviously. But to that end, you'll see there's all sorts of stuff there, like the disclosures, as well as some of the counseling you may have done previously that you can look at and refer back to so you have good information about those things that you've borrowed. This here is just an example of what some of the disclosure information that you may have already received looks like, right? Typically, you'll see that it's got information about the total amount of your loan, how much has been dispersed, as well as what a repayment schedule may look like for you based on what's currently been borrowed, as well as any incentives that your lender may offer. So with federal loans in particular, a lot of them will offer you an auto payment incentive, usually a 0.25% reduction in interest, if memory serves, last I looked. Again, I can't say that all of them do that, so I can't, we can't make that promise, but definitely look into it. If you can save 0.25%, why shouldn't you? And you wouldn't know that unless you were looking at the disclosures you were provided. Now, this is actually more on the consumer side of things. This is related to a private loan, right? And this is the version of disclosures, one of three that you ultimately get on the left-hand side of the screen whenever you borrow a private student loan. Now, you won't necessarily get three of them if you're looking at other types of consumer borrowing, you know, a personal loan, things like that, but you will get something very much like this so that you can look at the information related to the lending opportunity you're looking to pursue, right? It'll have roughly what you expect the total cost to be for the loan, as well as how much you'll pay in interest. That's what that finance charge is, whether or not you have the right to cancel, and if so, by when. And in the case of the case of a private student loan, the alternatives that are there for you. Okay. And to go with that, we also have a bill as an example. And this is actually from New Jersey Class as an example, just if anybody has heard of them. They are a private lending opportunity that is through the state of New Jersey for those residents that are there. This is actually what their bills look like. And you can see this person had two of them and how it breaks down and what money is going where. Now, to that end, as you go through and you're looking at your expenses, your budget, all of those resources that you have, the most important thing that you can do is determine what is realistic for you to pay. If you're a federal student loan borrower, you have options, right? You can see here on the screen that there are repayment plans that are just fixed amounts, like standard and graduated and extended, which is just how much you pay over a specified period of time. However, there are also income-driven plans, four of them in total, right, that you can potentially use if you ultimately qualify for them to reduce the amount of your payment. That's one of the benefits of federal student loans, right? They're meant to be a little more simple to repay. So please, if you're in a position where you're struggling, take a look at those options. Make sure you're choosing a plan that makes the most sense for you. Use those tools that are available to you. And again, the nice thing about doing that exit counseling is you get to kind of go through the process of estimating, given these different plans, which one may be the best one for you. Now, to go with this, there's also some other options that are available in the event that you have some type of struggle going on, including deferment and forbearance, which are temporary postponement options. I'm not going to go through these today. I'm providing them as resources, but this way you can take a look and see if this is something that may be helpful to you in the future, knowing, let's say you have a temporary issue that maybe you just need a few months to take care of. There's different eligibility requirements for each one, and they both act a little differently. So you want to make sure you're looking through those resources before you commit to pursuing one or the other. And again, to go with it, because this is a very common question, information about consolidation, right? Which is kind of like refinancing your federal student loans, but it is not refinancing your federal student loans, right? It feels like it. It's the process of kind of taking all your loans and putting them together, but it starts over your payment period, right? So it can reduce the amount of your overall payment, but it also potentially extends how long you're paying. So it's really important to kind of weigh the pros and cons of that to see if it's worth it for you given your specific circumstances. And of course, I would be remiss if we did not talk about the need to pay on time, like we've done over and over in this presentation. And I'm not going to go ahead and keep pushing that point, knowing we've talked about it, but especially with federal student loans, there are really significant consequences for first being delinquent, just being past due, and then ultimately going into default, right? Including having a really hard time with just even getting access to your money in certain circumstances. So if you are struggling, you're going to leave this presentation with resources on how to get help. For private loans, again, whether or not they can accommodate you with, trying to take care of delinquency and default is going to be very specific to each lender. You'll need to look at the documents that they provided to you for that. But just like there are serious consequences on the federal side, there's also serious consequences on the private loan side, right? Private loans are still student loans. They are not the easiest things to try and get rid of if you've committed to them, including through bankruptcy, right? You shouldn't necessarily count on that being the case. Lastly, I do have some additional information about contacts here for the Department of Education so that you know where to go should you need help with your federal student loans. Their website has a really nice set of contact information available there, and it's linked directly here on the slide. For private loans, go back to your documents, take a peek at who gave them to you, and that's who you want to get in touch with. And then lastly, again, information about iGrad. So most of the information that you saw here today came explicitly from iGrad. And again, this is a resource that's available to you now and after you leave school at no cost here at the university. And it includes tools, courses, articles, quizzes, webinars, videos. I like the infographics section because, again, I'm a visual person. It's a nice place for me to go to start learning about stuff. But again, this resource is there to help you understand the things that you need to achieve your financial goals, both now and after you leave school. So as you go through and get the materials from this presentation, please do create your iGrad account. It has information in it about how you can kind of learn to navigate the platform, the most important tools that are there for you, and what you want to do to be successful with this platform. But again, that is the end of our presentation here today. I want to thank everybody so much for being here. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I don't see that we had any in the chat, but if anybody wanted to, I'll give it a couple of seconds to see if anybody had any. All right. So it is not forever hold your peace. My contact information is here on this slide. Please do not hesitate to reach out. I truly mean it. When my favorite thing in the world is to talk to students. And I don't get to do it as much as I used to. So if you have questions, ask. It's more than my pleasure to help. Even if you're not sure if it's the right question for me, I'm happy to find where you need to go and assist on that front. I will be sharing these materials with our colleagues at GSAS so that they have them available should you like a copy of them, as well as they'll be available on that QR code within the next probably by the end of the day, if things go the way that I hope that they do. For now, though, I am going to go ahead and say thank you again for being here, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.